Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, a little island show that doesn't pull punches. It tries to fight beyond its weight class, and, well, I think we succeed off and on. My name is Robin Adair, and across town, my pugilistic partner, my partner in crime, the Croatian sensation himself, John Jurisic. And John, lots of feedback from our show that we had just a week ago.
The whole feedback thing is exploding, Robin. It's insane, okay? Hundreds and hundreds of comments and vile comments, rude, angry comments. I think we're part of the internet finally, Robin. Plenty of people so worked up about our interview with former MLA Sheila Orr, who stated, plainly, monarchy is safe in Canada. That really annoyed a ton of people, despite all the stones being thrown by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Sheila says she's not a monarchist, but believes it's an institution that helps define us as Canadians, more specifically, not Americans.
Absolutely, John. And we have heard from a number of people, but I got a couple of very good, thoughtful notes, I thought, from two people that I know personally. And I'll only use their first names, but I thought that they deserve to be heard on the Rumble Room. And Roman, you know who you are. You suggest that we check out Citizens for a Canadian Republic. And Roman also writes, Canada's evolution to full nationhood should not be inhibited by a minority who cling to the remnants of an empire built on oppression and racism, an empire that even the British believe is no more. And, I would say that Canada already is a full nation, fully functioning in the true sense of the word. We're also members of the British Commonwealth. We've retained the royal family. It's nothing less and nothing more than a figurehead institution. And it serves us well. And they've done a lot of polling, John. They've done a lot of polling across Canada outside of Quebec, where they've never liked the royal family since the Plains of Abraham. In the rest of the country, the majority of people do not necessarily want to change what we have with the parliamentary system. They like it just fine. There's no groundswell of support for a republic. Now, could this change in the future? Of course it could. So, I'm not saying never, but it's certainly not the trend that we're hearing about right now, at least in this country. And we do have, John, at least one more thoughtful note to the Sheila Orr comments, also coming from somebody I know who I used to work with at Czech TV. Maybe you'd like to take this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I would. Thanks again, everyone, for the comments. Makes the show quite interesting. Doug commented, this is your friend. Doug is more interested in people not bashing Prince Harry. He writes, the Institute, and in that sense he means the monarchy, and the British tabloid press have run a symbiotic relationship for mutual gain for at least 150 years, at the expense of public honesty and respect for those in the royal family who don't want the gilded cage. I feel really bad for Harry and Meghan, much like I felt bad for Diana. Well, we always welcome your opinions and will continue to share them, as long as they're fair and not insanely crazy. But let's move on. Last June, former Langford Mayor Stu Young led a humanitarian mission to Ukraine. Fabulous stuff that him and his crew were doing. Sister city agreements were signed with 4 towns in that war-ravaged country. Well, Robin, Stu, as we all now know, is clearly out of civic politics officially, and he's passed the baton to others who are continuing this very important work.
Yeah, and Bob Beckett is leading the charge this time, and he was on the last humanitarian mission. He's been on numerous humanitarian missions over the years, since I believe about 1995. Yeah. He's the former Souk fire chief, and he's heading back for the second time, again with videographer Brendan Strain, who works at CTV Vancouver Island, who's a documentarian, and he documented their last trip. He's also heading to the war zone with Ravi Parmar, who we've had on this show. He is the chair of the Souk School District, and they've signed some agreements as well with these same communities. I think it's great, these educational exchanges. Also, a representative of the Victoria Hand Project. They're a non-profit group that started out of UVic. They create prosthetic arms and hands. So we asked Bob Beckett whether it had always been the plan to go back to Ukraine.
The moment we arrived in Ukraine back in June and had a chance to have our first meeting with government officials in Lutsk, we realized that we were making a commitment, a long-term commitment, both during the war and obviously after the war, to help rebuild. So there was no question in our mind. It was a matter of when we were going to go back. And as it turned out, we had a successful fundraising on November the 12th at Bear Mountain. There was sufficient funds, and there was some unique synergies associated with Wonder Fund and Victoria Hand Project. And that allowed us to make a decision, and an easy decision, that we were committed to going back and doing 4 projects this time. As a humanitarian, my focus, the focus of our mission, has never been about military intervention, although I do personally believe that that's absolutely necessary to address the bully. But again, my focus has always been, throughout my entire life and career, on the humanitarian side of things. So it doesn't include, weapons. Our focus is firefighting and rescue equipment, medical supplies, assisting the Victoria Hand Project with prosthetics, and education. Helping the children over there succeed, and helping our children learn about the need to see the globe as a community, not just Langford or Greater Victoria.
And you touch on education. Education agreements were signed by you last time you were there, and now you're bringing the chair of the Souk School District along to sort of underline this.
Absolutely, and my understanding is that Ravi and SD62 have a number of projects that they're going to be working on over there, including taking art supplies and school supplies that Monk Office has generously provided.
Are you in touch with the Ukrainians? Have you heard what the situation is like there now?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm discussing the upcoming trip on a daily basis with our interpreter. We will be going into areas that have been struck by missiles that were not struck before, and we are going to an area close to the Belarus border because of the need up there. So we will be using due diligence. We have a good safety and security net in place, and we won't take any undue risks, but we are going into a war zone.
But it is more dangerous than last time.
Yes, it is.
And how can people make that donation? What's the best way for them to go if they want to reach out and make some kind of a contribution?
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if it's $5 or $500. If they make a check out to Langford Global Medic, one word, Ukraine Project, and mail it off to 936 Loch Glen Place, 100% of that money will go into the acquisition of medical supplies.
Always great to hear from Bob Beckett. These missions are simply extraordinary. There's such a tragedy going on over there. Any way that we can help is amazing. It's as well very inspiring to see all these brave Canadians. Like we don't get a sense of how dangerous it is to do this stuff. They're willing to travel to these places and do good work. This is very dangerous stuff. I cannot wait to hear from them upon their return.
We just had a young man recently pass away who was from Fanny Bay, originally from Ukraine, went to Ukraine as a medic and was killed in action. So there are Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians who are involved in that conflict. So it's happening, and Canadians are certainly tuned into it, John. And before we meet our special guest this week, I just wanted to comment on some comments that were made again on our last show. Our last show seemed to be getting all kinds of rumbling around. It's a rumble room after all. And we had numerous notes last week from anti-mandate advocates and people who are against the vaccinations and not buying the COVID story. And we posted a few of their comments. We didn't post them because we thought they were right. We just post them because we think it's interesting to have these debates. And we got our wrist slapped by YouTube. They actually pulled our show. They wouldn't run it with those opinions on it. So we took them off and YouTube put it back on. So, you know, obviously there are feelings on a corporate level in Canada and a corporate level internationally that some comments and some information about COVID-19 is not acceptable. So we will continue to carefully walk that line in the future, John.
Yeah, we certainly lived up to our reputation, didn't we, of the Victoria Rumble Room. We rumbled our way into a bit of trouble, but we are now, that was a great learning experience. And it was give us a sense of how extraordinarily sensitive this COVID stuff still is. There are a lot of strong feelings in Canada about mandates, which is why we saw the truckers' protests last year. The question we have is, that's the question now. Are these strong feelings being influenced by messages in the media and on the internet from the US, or are these homegrown? I'd like to know. We believe this is the case, that they're coming from the US, but we wanted to explore with someone who knows a lot more about the US attitudes and politics than us, right? And that's how we came across and found Jim Stockbridge.
Absolutely, John. I have some friends who live in Colorado, Ron and Renee Corsi, and they are former bureaucrats with the federal government down there. And they recommended that we speak to Jim Stockbridge, who a retired federal bureaucrat. He has in his life been a Democrat and he has been a Republican. He has been a candidate for the Democrats in state government and formally. He even as a youth lived in Eastern Canada, so he knows a little bit about Canada as well. Jim Stockbridge, a man with plenty to say. Let's zoom into Colorado. And now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room, all the way from Lakewood, Colorado, is Jim Stockbridge. And Jim, great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much. It's an honor, sir.
Well, I love that. I want to get into some of the issues that we share with our U.S. cousins. And we live in Victoria. British Columbia gets so many American visitors. They come by car, they come by plane, they come by train. And we're always struck by many of the similarities we share as North Americans. But of course, there are differences as well. And we'd like to sort of explore both of those things. And in the States, there have been some major demographic shifts. We've had demographic shifts here as well because of immigration over the last several decades, a lot of immigration from Asia, and it's really changing the makeup of what a Canadian is. And I think that that's a positive thing, but there's always growing pains. In the States, one of the big shifts has been the huge influx of Hispanics. We've had so many people arriving from Mexico, Cuba, South America. It's made a huge difference, particularly in the southern United States, to what an American actually kind of looks like. And what I guess my first question is, how big a factor do you think this is in this shift to the right?
Well, I think to a large extent, it's a fear factor that the folks that are really concerned about it typically are lower middle class or lower, and they're concerned about their economic well-being. And they see that rightly or wrongly that immigrants are taking jobs that they would otherwise have. I say rightly or wrongly, I think a lot of that is in the messaging that comes from the administration down, and that I think that President Trump was a purveyor of fear, and that he tried to play on that. And so for the lower middle class, the blue class workers, and those below the poverty level, they see Hispanics coming in, taking jobs that they think would otherwise be theirs.
Thank you for being on the show. It's really interesting to meet, well, not just to meet an American, but to meet an American who's studied his own country and also knows a lot about Canada. That's a unique combination. You actually lived here when you were younger. Does it make it therefore easier for you to understand and even explain potentially why a large amount of a majority of Canadians have agreed to get COVID-19 vaccinations, while as many as 90 million Americans refuse to get the jab. Are Americans generally more skeptical of government telling them what to do in the midst of a health crisis?
I think there are a couple factors. One is a distrust of government. In general, we've got a base level, as do my Canadian brothers, of vaccinations just in general.
Right.
So in addition to having just the hesitancy towards vaccination, I think you also have a lack of a good, strong message from leadership. And I think that under the Trump administration, they were divided enough within the administration itself that there wasn't a real strong unified push that would get those people who are not adamant anti-vaxxers to the vaccination. I think there was also a distrust in how quickly the vaccination made it into the mainstream and available. And people were saying it hasn't been well tested enough. I do understand that when you're fighting an unknown, you take the first straw and the first step as soon as you can. And so I think that a vast majority of the Americans decided, well, we're going to take it. And that some of the distrust that is being sown through our talk media, like through the Fox channel, that they're going to do it irrespective of that. And those folks who take their primary source of information from Fox are going to say, no, we're not going to do it. You can pretty well determine which party somebody belongs to based on their source of information. Fox, Republican, CNN, Democrat. I don't think it's so much the rapidity with which information is passed on to us. So I think it's more the integrity of the information. For instance, we have just heard from the January 6th committee transcripts that Sean Hannity, who has been a huge purveyor of the false information that the election was stolen from Trump in 2020, he has now been revealed to have said he never really believed that. But because he had a financial interest in portraying this as fact, even though it was not, I think that has swayed a lot of people because they believe him without having done the due diligence to check and find out if the information is correct. In fact, I was talking with a lady that I volunteered a food pantry with about the results of the last election we just had for our midterms. And she says, oh, well, you know that they're all false and everything else. And I questioned her. I said, I really don't understand where this is coming from. We've had 65 court cases, all of which have said our election system is solid and secure. And I said, what do you think about that? Oh, I don't read. I don't study up on that stuff.
On the Rumble Room here, we've done a lot of interviews and discussion about Canada's and NATO's role behind supporting Ukraine in the war with Russia. There's a large Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. So these are very relevant stuff, despite the fact that we're not providing the heavy equipment that the United States is doing. We've been thrilled that leadership has been strong from Joe Biden. But, you know, that was not, at least as much as we can determine, was not the case when Donald Trump was president. Do you think, so here's my question, do you think that the Russians actually took a chance and rolled the dice that the Americans would sit back because of the very quick pullout from Afghanistan and Trump's earlier threats to pull all aid from Ukraine?
Yes, I do think it was well thought out by Putin. I think it was more than just Trump. I think he was looking at the softness in the Republican Party and the fact that the Republican Party has backed away from some of our international commitments. And I think that they were taking a look at it and saying, you know what, the midterms are coming up. Republicans are going to take the House and the Senate. I think that's going to change dramatically how the United States is going to engage in things. And then we may go back to more of the Trumpian policies, which is we're going to isolate ourselves away from NATO. So yes, I think it was a strategic move on Putin's part. I don't think that Putin read the American public correctly.
Mhm.
And I think that a couple factors have had significant impact so that the midterms did not turn out to be the red wave that everybody expected them to be.
Mhm.
You know, it's interesting that there's a real shift in Canada towards being, I don't know, concerned about big government, concerned about rules and regulations from people at the higher levels that we didn't see previously. Traditionally, I think Canadians tend to be pretty amiable when it comes to governance, and we didn't have a revolution here, and we tend to be people who like big banks and big stores and big business and haven't really had the same revulsion about that maybe exists in some sectors of the United States. All of that said, we do watch closely what goes on in the U.S. We saw this insurrectionist movement in January last year, where they marched on the White House and broke in the doors, and people were killed, and it was a terrible situation. American flags everywhere, people screaming, "We want our freedom." And then we have our truckers up here. They have a big cavalcade of trucks that goes into Ottawa, our capital, all waving Canadian flags, saying they want to bring down the Prime Minister. They want the Prime Minister to resign, and screaming they want freedom. And you have to think it's influenced in some ways by what goes on in the United States. And so I guess my question to you on this is, why do you think this group of people, whether they're on our side of the border or your side of the border, are so angry? And do you think they have a right, a justification to be as angry as they are?
Yes, I think they've got a right. I think that everybody has a right and a voice. And I think it's just the legality of how they express that. Why I think that there's that big divisiveness in this country. And if you take a look at the United States, you can see that we're more liberal on both of our borders. And so all the states on the Pacific and on the Atlantic tend to vote Democrat. The interior tend to vote Republican. Part of that is that I think, I like to use the trope that basically says, we could not have gotten to a Barack Obama had we not had a George Bush. We could not have had a Donald Trump had we not had a Barack Obama. And what Obama was, is I think Obama was a globalist. And as a result of that, he was taking a look at the United States and saying, gee, even our poorest people are so much better off than the vast majority of other people in the world. And so he was going to try to create some equity. As a result, I think a lot of our lower middle class and our poor felt like they were left behind. And they felt a true distrust of government. And that distrust of government was pervasive across everything, from vaccinations to economic policies to laws, rules and regulations that are being implemented. And so I think that you have that that class of individuals who did not benefit from the globalist movement, and they have backed Trump, and Trump caught the wave. He got the message. He understood the anger that those folks had, and he has sown that level of distrust across that segment of our population, and even more so, not just geographically, but economically. And he has capitalized on that at the expense of the unity of the United States.
Jim, my final question,
Yes, sir.
and thank you for your perspectives. Really great. So let's do a little bit of a future gazing here. If Donald Trump finds a way to get the Republican nomination, and it sometimes might seem you're kidding, really, will that ever happen? Well, we have learned to not underestimate this guy ever. So let's say he gets the nomination. Let's say he wins the presidency somehow in 2 years. So my question to you is, what will you do? What will happen?
Seriously?
Yes.
Having grown up in Toronto, I actually asked my wife a couple months ago, and my question to her was, if Trump gets reelected, would you like to move to Canada?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would be so divisive in this country. He is such a vindictive person that you could say that the democracy would be completely lost. Even if he loses the election, he has already shown his cards. He showed his cards in 2016 when he was asked if he would accept the outcome of the election, and his answer was, well, we'll see. I think that there would be a distinct possibility for significant civil unrest if he were to lose, because he would say that it was stolen again. That concerns me. And I think there would be significant issues if he won, in the sense that he would be vindictive in policies and procedures against everybody that he did not think had blind loyalty to him. I think that would be devastating, not just for the United States, but for our North American partnerships. And I think it would also be terrible for the world. I think that the United States cannot be trusted with international relationships to be able to sustain a position over anything more than one single administration. I think we vacillate too broadly and too quickly, that for somebody else as a major nation to trust us, I think is ill-advised.
Interesting and fascinating to get an American perspective on these issues, or at least a perspective from a Democrat in an extraordinarily divided country.
Absolutely, John. And, we have mentioned this debate that's been going on in Canada for quite some time. And, we've been criticized a little bit because you and I have both taken a stand where we are in favor of vaccinations. We are in favor largely of the mandates, although we're glad the mandates are passed and we don't really want to see them brought back if at all possible. But getting a vaccination, I think, is a fairly safe step. I don't buy the words that are spoken by some that they actually kill people and they create more problems than they solve. However, we're willing to have somebody on who has maybe a more right-wing view than we do, not necessarily just on mandates, but on things in general. For example, we did invite Aaron Gunn, a local Victoria commentator, to come on the Rumble Room. Haven't heard back from him yet. That doesn't mean that the offer isn't still out there, Aaron. So we'd be happy to have somebody on who doesn't necessarily share our views on all these things, because we think it's important that views be heard. And I'd also like to just now talk for a moment about a former boss of mine, Czech TV news director Tony Cox, a former news director for 20 years, has passed away just short of the age of 87 from cancer. It happened after Christmas. Tony Cox came from Australia after arriving in Canada as a young man. He landed in Alberta, where he began his broadcasting career. Eventually, he arrived in Victoria, and through the 70s and 80s, for 20 years, he served as Czech TV's news director. Even after he retired, he'd fire off letters to local newspapers if he thought that things weren't being handled fairly for his old newsroom. And we started the Victoria Rumble Room, John, and Tony Cox used to sort of weigh in once in a while. I'd get messages from him on various stories, which I always really appreciated. And just before Christmas, we ran our Best of Christmas show and got feedback from Tony again. And you got to think this is one of the last messages that Tony had a chance to express in a news fashion. We chatted about what an interesting year 2022 had been. And Tony wrote about his past in journalism and at Czech TV. Interesting years. It was a time when truth was paramount and editorial content was frowned upon. It was a great team at Czech TV during my years. So a thoughtful epitaph from Tony Cox himself, and rest in peace. Certainly great to have people like this in our lives in journalism. And on that note, John, time to wrap the show.
Yeah, you bet. That program, and there's a group of you. There's sort of that, and I'm talking to one of them, one of the great folks from that team at Czech way back, and it's you don't think you're getting older. The years go by, but certainly that is happening, and folks are passing away. And I remember Tony, and And I remember the whole audio. It was a fantastic show to watch. And yet, and here we are. So very poignant, sad times, but nonetheless, the news must roll on. And you and I are capturing that spirit within the Rumble Room. And so if you want to follow us, and you can join us many different ways, certainly on Facebook. You know what? The groups have sort of grown out of our show, and we have a few of them. We're thinking of kind of filtering things down a little bit, but one that's very, very popular is one called on Facebook, one called the Victoria Rumble Room Friends. That's with a small case F. We encourage you to join that. Of course, we have a Twitter site, we have a YouTube site when it comes back on, when our punishment is over, and that's right. We also have an Instagram site. We have a TikTok site, which also generated lots of comments from Sheila's show last week. So, Robin, that's it for me, at least for today. I remain your humble servant, John Jurisic.
And Johnny, as always, I'm equally humble in your presence. I'm Robin Adair, and rumble on.